Hello and welcome to another GIMP Python Foo tutorial. In this tutorial we're going to be continuing from the extreme unsharp desaturation tutorial that was in the previous video. What we're going to do with this one is basically take that same effect that we've created, but we're going to allow for user input instead of always sticking to the same radius, amount, threshold and desaturation mode. So we're going to let the user decide what those values should be. The first thing we need to do is to change the name of our function. So I'm just going to change it to extreme unsharp desaturation option. And then remember, with my tutorial versions of these scripts, I've got tut on the end, just so you've got something live that you can see me doing. Obviously I've already made these scripts before, so these are kind of doubling up on my system at the moment. The first thing I need to do is easy enough. I just need to add the arguments to the main function so that the plugin is going to be expecting them. So we already know from our previous work that the variables we're working with are for the radius, the threshold, the amount, the threshold, and the mode of the desaturation. So that should be pretty straightforward. When we do this, we want to try to remember to use sensible variable names for the arguments for the function, so that we can understand what it is we're looking for. The next thing we do is go down to the parameter section of the register argument that we've got down here, or the register arguments, sorry, that we've got down here. And we're going to add those three variables as GUI inputs. Okay, so GUI, graphical user interface, or we'll just say GUI, GUI inputs that the user can play with. The great thing about GIMP Foo is that it actually comes with its own GUI library that's set up to work with minimal fuss for the developer. So you can throw in just a very few simple details and GIMP actually builds all of those lovely dialogues for you. So we're going to add three user input options. We're going to have to do them underneath the PF image and PF drawable, because that's where those parameters are held. But to decide which ones we should use, it's wise that we consult the user documentation, because there's lots of different options that you can choose. So the documentation can be found at www.gimp.org/docs/Python. So I'll just take you to that quickly so you can see it for yourself. And we scroll down to the section called Plugin Framework. You'll see a whole bunch of options beginning with PF. So here's the plugin framework. And then down here we have all of these different options. Now this looks a little bewildering. You know, there's a lot of options there, but once you get familiar with the kinds of things that you expect to see in a GIMP dialog box, these begin to make quite a lot of sense, and it should be pretty easy for you to pick the ones that are useful for you. Now it's just worth pointing out this little piece of jargon up here. It tells us the params parameter holds a list of parameters for the function. It is a list of tuples or tuples. Note that you do not have to specify the run type, image or drawable parameters, as GIMP Foo will add these automatically for you. The tuple format is type, name, description, default, and then any extra options that get put on the end. And then it tells us the allowed codes below. Now that might sound like a lot of Pythonese and a lot of kind of jargon that you're not familiar with, but all it's really telling us is the kind of structure it's expecting. It's just kind of trying to explain that structure to us. Now we're going to be looking at some live examples of that, so you'll get to see what that looks like, and hopefully it won't be too confusing. What it's basically telling us is that each parameter is held in something that's a little bit like a list. If you remember from the last video, a list is a collection of values. They're all assigned the same label, and they're set in square brackets. And well, if you look closely at the parameters, they're nested within square brackets. So we'll have a look over here and you can see we've got a square bracket there and a square bracket there. So this is actually telling us that these items here, the PF image and the PF drawable, are items in a list. But what we can also see, because they're in parentheses themselves, and I think I said this in the last video as well, things in parentheses like these are also called tuples, which is another type of list, a kind of special kind of list. So what we have here is a list of tuples, and those tuples take that format. So that format is the one that's explained there. The type, the name, the description, the default, and then any extras that come after it. So that's just what that's trying to explain. Like I said, that can be a little bit confusing, but we won't get too bogged down in that for now. All we need to know is that parameter arguments accept lists of tuples, and that sounds more complicated than it really is. So firstly, we need to take a value from the user for the radius. Now, when we looked at the documentation before, we know that the radius is a float value. There is a float option, which we can see here, pf float. And if you're familiar with different user interface options in GIMP, you might be able to picture what that one looks like. You might remember that from some of the other ones you've seen. You might be able to remember some of the other things you've seen, the other dialog options you've seen. Like pf slider, you might already be able to visualize what that looks like. You'll get to see copies of all of these in a minute. There is actually a dummy script that was created by a developer called Akana Peck. It's called pyui.py, so pyui.py, which is a little bit of a mouthful. And in that, she demonstrates what each parameter actually looks like in a GUI, and you can see what kinds of arguments that they take. So I'll put a link to her particular copy of that in the description. You can find that at gimpbook.com/scripting. However, when I've played around with Peck's script, it didn't actually fit on my screen properly. There was, some resolution issues or something like that. So what I actually did was I made two smaller scripts that show half of each of these parameters. So, basically showing up to about there in one script and then showing up to about there in the other script, right? So I broke it up so you could see them both. And I also changed the variable names a little bit just to make it a little bit clearer to me and to absolute beginners. So if you find those helpful, you can download those from my GitHub stuff as well. I'll just quickly show you what they look like just so you can get a sense of all of the options we've got. I will need to work on an image, so we'll just get up the trusty tutorial image. So then in my filters, I created these two plugins which don't do anything. Show UI options and show more UI options. So this shows us examples of what each of those things look like. So if we were to choose pf int, we get just a value box that we can type an integer into. The same is true of a float. The user just has to type in a floating point number. If we want to provide a string, again, they just type in a string. Obviously, the difficulty with these three is it presents the user with a text box essentially, but it's expecting a different type of value each time. So you just want to, when you're thinking through the usability of your script, you want to think through what will the user actually think to do with the options that you give them. And then there's some other things, so you can, text, you can choose color. They've also introduced a UK version of spelling of color, which appeals to me because I'm from the UK. There's options for the image, the layer, the channel, the drawable that you're working on. There's some toggles and Boolean things, and then the other half of the UI options show us some of the other things. So these are the ones that are a little bit more useful, I find often. We've got radio options. So if you need to, let them differentiate between something like this. So if you remember on the desaturate tool dialog, you could choose between lightness, luminosity, or average by clicking on a radio button. So it only picks the one of the group that's selected. Options can be quite helpful if you need to give people an option, but you want to give them a drop down list. If you've got a lot of options, then obviously you don't want to use radio buttons because the radio buttons will go on forever, so you can just put it in a nice tidy drop down box. Spinner's quite nice because that lets you provide a set amount of values and a range within which they can put in values, so that's quite helpful. Adjustment's actually the same as spinner. Slider is another nice one. We just get this sliding effect and you can choose a value for that. And then we've got things like file uploads, directory names, and then fonts, brushes, patterns, gradients, palettes. Those are all artistic things that we're not going to touch, but you might find a use for those in later work. So you can see the code for these examples, as I said, in the GitHub stuff that I'm going to upload. I'll just quickly show you what it looks like, just so you can see. So here we've got all of the stuff down here. This is what the string looks like, the value. There's some odd ones, like when we look at things like the radio buttons, you can see that starts to get a little bit more complicated because it has its own tuple for the radio parameter, but then the group of radio buttons is a tuple containing other tuples. So there's like three nested lists or three nested tuples within that parameter list. So it goes several layers deep, and it's hard to follow what you're doing sometimes. So you'll find that using white space like this and indenting everything just makes it a lot easier for you to keep track of what you're looking at. Anyway, so all of this is quite abstract. We'll get into actually applying this knowledge to some live code. This is what we're working on. So you might think that PF float is the best option. So the user can type in any float that they want. That might be the best choice, but looking at the second set that we had, things like the slider and the spinner, I think they look quite promising too. The thing I don't like about the float, as I mentioned before, is it lets the user type in anything that they want, and I would prefer to restrict what they can actually access. So both the spinner and the slider have the same three items within them. So I'll just show you those in the code again. So we can see a spinner takes the spinner variable, or it's called the spinner variable. The name of it is the spinner. It has a value that it takes, and then we've got this tuple at the end, which basically tells us the minimum value, the maximum value, and the incremental steps that it will go up by. So every time you click on the spinner, the up or down arrow on that spinner, it will go up in increments of 0.5, so 1, 1.5, 2, 2.5, and so on. And the slider allows us to do the same thing. It lets us similar kind of setup to begin with a maximum range as the kind of default value. So this is the default value for the spinner as well. And again, we've got the minimum range, the maximum range, and the step value. So the slider is just going to be whole numbers from 1 to 100. So that gives us an idea of the two kind of best options we've got. Now the thing I like about these is because I can set the maximum values instead of if the user just wrote whatever they wanted in a float, it means they can't accidentally enter a number that's out of range and crash our script or make it do things that we don't want it to do. So the original UnsharpMask plugin has a maximum radius of 500 and a maximum amount of 10. So if I set those as the maximums in my script, then it will stop the user from kind of introducing any problems into the code. And I think that makes either of those a better choice than a PF float. So after that, it's just a matter of usability. You just pick the one that you think is reasonable. So I'm going to pick the slider for radius and amount, since those are the ones that were in the original UnsharpMask. And for the desaturation mode, I'm going to use the same method that the GIMP developers picked there too, and I'll set that as a radio option. Now I can't pull all of those code snippets from the PDB, so we have to remember them basically. So it's a good idea to keep a note of them somewhere, and you can refer to sample scripts like the ones that Carnapec produced or the one that I've produced and made available as well. So I'm just going to put all of that information in so you can see what that looks like. Okay, so you can see what I've got here is the PF slider is the type that we had up here. The radius is the name. Radius is the description as well, but I've got a capital R because it's going to be printed somewhere. Then I've got the default value, which is 5, and then I've got this tuple at the end, which is those extra values that it takes. So a minimum value of 0, a maximum value of 500, and a step value of 0.5. And remember, when we write in our code, we need to add these commas because this is a continuation of a list, and list items are always comma separated. If you forget these commas, that will be an area where you have a bug to find later. So stick that comma in and you will save yourself a bug. So here we have our next slider to take user input, the one for amount, default value of 5, minimum of 0, maximum of 10, and the step value of 0.1. Because there's only 10 values, you can be a bit more precise with it. And then for the desaturation one, I've used the radio option. Now the radio option, as I said previously, is a little bit more complicated because it takes a couple of layers of extra options. The stuff at the beginning is pretty straightforward. We've got the type, the name, the description. we've got the default value, which is the one I used before, desaturate lightness, but then we've got 3 radio options. Now these are in a group on their own, so they are in their own tuple, and then within that tuple we have 3 other tuples. Okay, so the tuple for the radio buttons has a label and then the actual value associated with that label. So you can imagine in a box, in a dialog, you're going to see that and then a circle that you can click on, and clicking on that circle gives us desaturate lightness as an option that it feeds back into the parameters. Okay, so that's what we need to kind of remember. Again, just look at this code very closely because you want to look where the commas are. It makes sense really. Like if you think about it, what we're actually telling the GIMP is that this is what it looks like. You know, it's nested tuples, and the tuples themselves are comma separated. So you need to remember to always include those commas because that's what Python's going to expect to see, to know that it's a tuple. So it takes a little bit of getting used to, but you'll get there in the end, and it's once you know what you're doing, it's pretty straightforward. Now, just one quick thing to point out what's going on. As I've said before, the image and the drawable come from GIMP itself. The GIMP knows what those are, and it's actually coming from down here, but GIMP knows where to get that information from. These new arguments that we've put in, radius, amount, threshold, and mode, all come from here. So we've got radius, amount, and mode. So I need to include threshold because I've forgotten to put that in. Actually, no, I don't. I've just remembered why I don't do this. I don't offer threshold as an actual value because I find that toggling the threshold actually doesn't have desirable effects. So remember, I actually didn't let my users have that option. So what I need to do is actually get rid of that up the top because we're not going to allow them to change the threshold. That's something that we're going to pass in here. So I'm glad I pointed that out because I had a sneaking suspicion I was explaining something that was pretty obvious, and then turned out I wasn't. I was pointing out a mistake I was about to make. So as I was about to say, these values for radius, amount, and mode that we're asking for up here that get passed in, they're being passed in from these parameters. So when the script first runs, a box is going to pop up, the user is going to put those values in, and then it gets fed back into this code and it will run. Now because we're taking that information from the user, we don't need to have that information up here anymore because we don't need to pass in this radius to here. Because if we do that, it's going to overwrite the user inputted radius variable. So we can just get rid of those, and I can change that line of code because that comment, because that's no longer true. Okay, so that should be everything that we need. Oh, and one other thing I just remembered. I got rid of the radius and the amount. I forgot to get rid of the mode. So I've set the mode here before, but we're no longer using the mode there. So I can get rid of mode from there, and I need to change this to mode because that is now the name of the variable that we're looking for. And then one final check I need to make is that I've changed all of the register values because I didn't actually go through and do all of that properly before. So we're going to change the name up here to just to include options, because that was what I changed up there, just option, not options. We also change the long description, so let's say with values chosen by the user. We can have extreme, unsharp, and desaturate tute. We'll call it options tute. And then because this is opening up a dialog box, the convention that we use in software when we're taking, when we're not just going to run something, but we're going to like open up another box to ask for user input, we usually have an ellipsis after it. So you'll probably have seen that in various pieces of software that you've used before. In fact, I bet if I click up here, you can see an example of that. So if I go to new window, clicking on that will just open up a new window like I asked for. If I click on open, then it will open up a dialog box asking me what I want to open. So this is a fairly conventional thing that we want to stick with. So for your own snippets of code, you want to do the same thing because you know that's the kind of thing people would expect. And the last thing I need to change is the value down here, so we just call that option, and that should be correct. So let's save that, I will close the GIMP and refresh it. If you've wondered why sometimes I close the GIMP and refresh it and other times I don't, basically the reason is if you make any changes to the register, you need to restart GIMP. If you just make changes up here but the register stays the same, then you can just refresh the scripts. So the register is kind of like a more ingrained part of the GIMP which forces a restart or requires a restart. Anything you change up here you don't need to worry about. So if you've wondered why sometimes I change, sometimes I just refresh and sometimes I actually quit GIMP, that's the reason. Anyway, so we'll go to File and Open Recent, Tutorial Image, Filters, Enhance. I'm getting a lot of these extreme unsharp things going on now, but here we've got the tutorial one, that's the one I just made, so we'll run that, and then we've got our options, so let's go crazy. There you go. Well, that looks pretty good. There you go. So there you go, now we know that works, and I didn't change the undo group settings before, so since we already took care of that, we should show that Control Z undoes the whole effect, and then I can re-show, I can do it again, and I can choose the more standard, say 5 and 5, and we'll try a different desaturation. There we go, and that's a different desaturation effect. So there we can see that our script is working and it now accepts user input. So you give the user back a little bit of choice and freedom over what they're doing. Anyway, this has been a very wordy tutorial. I hope I haven't kind of thrown too much jargon at you, or if I did throw too much jargon at you, I hope you've been able to follow along anyway. Anyway, thanks for watching, and in the next tutorial, we're going to make a more complicated script, which is actually revisiting one of my very old GIMP tutorials. We're going to take one of those effects and make it from scratch. So I look forward to seeing you there. Thanks for watching.